Hello all, thank you so much for coming to this. This can be a sensitive and important issue, so I really appreciate your interest in this. I am relatively new to this. I had no idea that I would be speaking to crowds 2 years ago, so it's really been a learning experience, and I've enjoyed every minute of it and all the conversations I've had with everyone. So thank you for having me. I am here sharing a personal rather than a professional experience. I'm from Oregon. I grew up there essentially and was there when they were starting to introduce legislation for death with dignity type of laws. I was there when all the discussion was happening, and now my mother was a nurse. I'm a nurse. At the time I was working in a medical office, and my aunt and my grandmother had both had breast cancer, and so this seemed incredibly important. We all talked about it. You know, I didn't know it would become that important in my life, but I'm here to share my story because I consider my stepfather, Dr. Jack Rowe's death a good death. And so I tell his story because he died after ingesting the medication prescribed by his doctor under Oregon's Death with Dignity Act, and I was there with him. His death was incredibly peaceful and painless, and exactly as he planned. So I'm sharing our experience, but then I also think it's important to share information about the actual law, the data collected, the concerns around the laws, and then, you know, hopefully a bit of information about legislation and what's happening currently. So these days, most people have heard of Brittany Menard. Do you all recognize this photo? Some? Okay, well, she was a 29-year-old California woman who was diagnosed with glioblastoma, a form of brain cancer that is a difficult one. She fought it, she had surgery, she treated it, and it's aggressive, and it came back. And California did not have a death with dignity law, and she decided that she wanted control over her death in the face of her glioblastoma. And so she and her family moved to Oregon to take advantage of their law. And she worked with the national organization Compassion and Choices, and they did a lot of media campaign, and she was really just a beautiful, well-spoken, wonderful woman, and brought a lot of attention to this issue. She was one of 105 people who died in Oregon in 2014 using their law, using the medication prescribed under the law. She died November 1st, 2014. And this is my stepfather, Dr. Jack Rowe, who was another one of the 105 people who used the medication that year. He died 10 days after Brittany Menard, using the same option. But he did not have to move there. He had lived there since 1999 after he and my mother, Jan, married. Jack was a retired neurologist. He was an accomplished physician, author, researcher, and lecturer. He specialized in epilepsy. And he really cared about the ethics of being a physician, you know, as do all physicians. And as a neurologist, he had diagnosed things like glioblastoma and ALS and Parkinson's disease and various forms of dementia, so he knew how people died from those diseases. But to us, he was Grandpa Jack. So there's my mom, my son Ben, Jack, me, and my husband Doug. Believe it or not, in this day and age, my parents spent 2 months with us every winter in Cleveland for like 9 years. It just is how our family worked. So we got to know each other very well. I got to learn about his family, and both of our families had lost a lot of family members, and he had been executor to a few different estates. So we really talked about end-of-life planning. It was just a conversation we had in our family. And you know, occasionally Oregon's Death with Dignity law would come up, but we really didn't know that it would become important to us. In 2013, he was diagnosed with something called Lewy body disease, and that is something that you die from with dementia when you die. And as a neurologist, of course, that was his worst nightmare. And at that point in 2013, he really felt like he had about 5 good years ahead of him. He had diagnosed himself early and had that corroborated.
So in August of 2014, they actually came in the summer for a visit. We went to Lake Chautauqua, and we were standing in line to get on the paddle steamship, and just standing in line was enough he was done for the rest of the day. And I really noticed it because he was always the one who would work with my son and show him around how things worked. When he went back to Oregon, he had already been scheduled for an appointment, and he got that call that nobody ever wants to get the next day, come right back in and give blood. And he ended that day in the hospital having a bone marrow biopsy and 2 units of blood. And he had this diagnosis of myelodysplastic syndrome, which can be a form of bone marrow cancer. At that point, he was in pretty poor general health for various reasons, and he was given 4 to 6 months to live, and he really felt that was optimistic. It's not uncommon to be given more time than you have, actually. Now, it took us by surprise because we were kind of focused on his other health issues, but myelodysplastic syndrome did make him eligible to use Oregon's Death with Dignity Act. The Lewy body disease does not, because by the time you reach the terminal phase of that illness, you're not mentally competent to request the medication. So he really felt empowered by this diagnosis. He shared the diagnosis with his family and friends and said right away that he was going to use the law. He was very open. He was actually quite good at being devil's advocate, and so if anybody had questions about it, he wanted to talk about it. I was not surprised by his decision at all. So just as some people are viscerally opposed to this, he really felt that it was his intrinsic right to have control of his death in the face of his terminal illness, especially because he lived in Oregon. And then my parents were talking about having a memorial for him, and he said, well, heck, if you guys are gonna celebrate me, I wanna celebrate. So he invited everyone for what he knew would be his last birthday party. And friends and family came from all over to help celebrate Jack. He went about using his little bit of energy to, research the law, download all the forms, start making his appointments with his physicians. And then Jack being Jack, he was very practical. He spent his limited energy and time taking care of all his personal and business affairs, making lists of things for us to do. In a perfect example of Jack, he gave my mother his password book for the computer, everything he needed. She figured out that instead of actual passwords, he had written codes to the passwords. And so they had to spend time deciphering his codes so that they would be useful. During that time, he had signed up for hospice. In our family, a terminal diagnosis, pretty much we just sign up for hospice. We believe in them and have great respect for their work. But so he received a few transfusions just to give him some energy, but did not take other forms of chemotherapy or anything. Sorry, I didn't do the birthday roast. So that's the picture. That's just the family that came to his party. He is in the blue vest there. My mother's next to him. He's pretty frail at that point. During his last month, he really took the time to write down his thoughts about this because it was important to him. It bothered him that physicians, that the American Medical Association, which he had been a member of for years and years, had an adamant position against what they call physician-assisted suicide. They still have it. So he put his thoughts down, and he really thought that it would never be touched. He thought, JAMA, Journal of the American Medical Association, will never touch this. But my mother pursued it in his honor, and they did publish it posthumously on September 1st, 2015, in their A Piece of My Mind section. In the article, Jack said that he felt lucky to live in Oregon because he wanted an easy and pain-free death. There, he said it. My mother shares that Jack was very relieved that he would not have a long, drawn-out death from dementia and that he would not be putting our family through that distressing process, as he called it. Now, my mother was a nurse. I had been a nurse. His son was a paramedic, or had been. So, we would have been okay with helping him in whatever way he chose, in addition to hospice care. But he was adamant about this. In the article, he stated his belief in assisted death, as he called it, and he laid out his beliefs about physicians' roles in the end-of-life care, which is first relieve pain and suffering, and then do no harm, and then respect a patient's right to choose. The Death with Dignity Act has been legal since 1997 in Oregon, so while Jack was praised for writing about this so openly, the editor-in-chief actually wrote to my mother and said what an important piece it was. He's one of 991 people in Oregon who've chosen this option. So he didn't start this discussion, but he really chose to add to it. And speaking to fellow physicians, he wrote, "If you knew you were dying soon, how would you want to die if you had the choice?" He thought fellow physicians should try to help each individual patient deal with his or her problem to the best of our ability. Sometimes for a dying patient, the option of an easy assisted death is the most merciful, caring, and I believe ethical way to do that. Jack chose November 11th as his day to die. Choosing the date was hard, as you can imagine. It's never the right time to lose your loved one, and my mother was never fully ready. But after a couple of nasty episodes with pain and infection and his increasing risk of hemorrhage, my mother agreed that he should set a date. He spent the night before preparing the medication with his son. He had been a fly fisherman and had tied flies, and yet his fingers were kind of numb now, and he needed help opening the capsules. So it is okay for someone to help prepare the medication, but you have to take it yourself. My mother hovered nearby as they prepared it, not wanting to help, but knowing that her time with Jack was really ending. Even though she understood and respected his decision, it was hard knowing that the end was truly coming. I flew into town that night before, and the morning we gathered at that table, and we talked, and we told him we loved him and respected him, and that if he wanted to change his mind, that was okay. We just kept saying how surreal that moment was. He had already taken, you take a medication to help you so that you don't regurgitate the sleeping medication. He had already taken that, so he had a window of time to take the next step. So he said, well, it's time, and he got up and he mixed the medication with peach juice and walked into the bedroom, and it was a beautiful sunny day in Southern Oregon, which doesn't always happen. He had classical guitar music playing, and it was just lovely, and we surrounded the bed. He sat in the bed, and my mother and his son held his hands for a short time. He drank the medication quickly. You have to do it quickly. And he became drowsy, and we actually had to lay him down within 5 minutes, and he died within 15 minutes. He was pretty frail. It was incredibly peaceful and painless as far as we know, and it was exactly the way he planned. My mother and I talked about how we felt compelled to share our experience because compared to what he could face, he had a very peaceful death. After he died, we started working on the lists of things to do that he had left us. And my job was to call the life insurance company. And when they asked what the cause of death was, I automatically said myelodysplastic syndrome. And then I thought, I don't know if that's right. And I realized that he had been studying the law, and I really needed to do the studying. I needed to know the details. It turns out I was right. Oregon's law was written knowing that no other state had a law like it. They were the first to pass this law. And so they knew that everybody would be watching, and that its parameters were important. So the law says that an adult resident of Oregon is given a terminal diagnosis and a prognosis of 6 months to live, and that has to be corroborated by another physician. They have to agree on that. They must verbally request the life-ending medication 2 times separated by 15 days. So this process ends up taking about 3 weeks in the life of a terminally ill patient. They have to be mentally competent. Either physician may refer for a mental health evaluation if there's a concern, or they can deny the request. They must be counseled on their other end-of-life options, hospice and pain management and comfort care, spiritual care, and they may change their mind at any time. Then a third written request has to be made after that 15-day period, and with 2 witnesses, one of whom at least must not be related or able to benefit in any way. And then the patient has to self-administer the medication. So people have lost their window of time because of either physical or mental inability after time. Participation is voluntary by physicians and pharmacists, and I say other healthcare providers just because Jack's hospice nurse would have been comfortable being there. We didn't need it as a family, but she doesn't administer the medication at all, but she could be there. And the identified identities remain confidential, and insurance policies are not affected. Of course, there are concerns about these laws. Originally, it was this concept of a slippery slope, and that the elderly and disadvantaged, minorities, uninsured, uneducated, the elderly, I think I said, and women would be most affected. Coercion was a concern and remains a concern, and that people in pain would really be seeking this out. But they did collect data, so they have information in Oregon about who's used this law. And since 1998, 1,545 people have had the prescription written. 991 people have died using the medication. So 64% have used it. So they find that just having the prescription provides peace for people and the thought that they have control if they need it. This has been less than 1% of the deaths over this time frame, so it's really a very small percentage of people who use this. The patient characteristics, 97% are white, but I have to tell you, Oregon doesn't have a lot of diversity. So, but the median age is 71. 71% have some college education or higher, so it's an educated community who are using this, and they have some form of insurance, so they do have access to health care. An interesting thing is that 90% were enrolled in hospice, so hospice is really an important part of this. That I believe that the national average for hospice use is about 45%, so it's really it's an important part of that. And 94% have died at home. People say that they want to die at home, and when they use this law, they tend to die at home. And instead of pain control, loss of autonomy is the greatest concern, is what they find. So people aren't driven to this because of pain control. Cancer was the largest terminal diagnosis, followed by heart disease and then ALS. Another argument against these laws is that physicians should never be involved in hastening death. Jack's own physician was happy to share his thoughts when we asked him. He was comfortable with it. He said he had to take time to figure it out. He went home and he thought about it. This is personal on every level. So he told us that each physician must grapple with the ethical implications of an assisted death and hopefully view it as the ultimate act of kindness, which is becoming difficult as we continue to lose connection to those we care for. You can understand that. You don't have a strong connection sometimes. And then his oncologist was also happy to share her thoughts. She had just moved to Oregon, so she actually had to take time to research this and make sure she was comfortable writing the prescription, and then she said she was happy to act as co-signer. Physicians thoughts on this. This is a Medscape ethics report asking the question, should physician-assisted suicide be allowed? And I'm looking at the yellow bars. Respondents included more than 17,000 US physicians, and in 2014, 54% said yes, compared to 46% who had said yes in 2010. So thoughts may be changing on this. After the first time I talked, someone said to me, you know, you're really not addressing the elephant in the room. You haven't talked about the difference between assisted dying and suicide. And so my comparison is a mentally capable adult with 6 months or less to live understands that they are dying because of their illness and then chooses to control the time, place, and with whom they are surrounded as they die. Unfortunately, we have experienced death by suicide as well. Tragically, my own father ended his life alone in the hills of San Diego at the age of 25. As my mother says, he did it with no call for help or chance for a discussion. I was 2, my mother was 23. Because of my father's very brief battle with depression and his sudden death, my mother had to quickly figure out how to make a life for us, and she moved on, like was common at the time, without talking much about him or his death. So over time, I've come to understand that his depression was a mental illness that caused a healthy young man to believe that he had no other options than to violently end his life alone. These are kind of the hallmarks of a very tragic suicide. So while people want to lump my father and my stepfather's deaths together as suicides, I can just tell you that in our own family's experience, there's just simply no comparison. In contrast, Jack's openness about his wishes helped us all process all of this. He had every reason to live. These are his own twin grandsons that were 2 at the time. But he ended his life because he knew he was dying soon and he wanted control and peace. Oregon's law made it possible for all of us to be together during this process and to have no fear of legal prosecution. On a purely sentimental note, after months of working with JAMA to edit and find a publishing date, my mother found out on September 1st that Jack's article had been published. This was big in our lives. It happened to be the exact same day that she and friends had already gathered to spread his ashes on his favorite watering hole or fishing hole in the Rowe River in Southern Oregon. I've also been asked about how I and our family have felt about this since Jack's death. Do we feel remorse? Do we feel lots of other words that were interesting to me? And I don't feel remorse. I feel great peace. He made his choice, and he had a peaceful death. I also wanted to respect his other kids, and they all felt that this was important to share as well. There was a 2009 study in the Journal of Pain and Symptom Management that came to the conclusion that pursuit of aid in dying does not have negative effects on surviving family members and may be associated with greater preparation and acceptance of death. I personally felt that a lot of my grief happened at the time of his diagnosis and leading up to his death. I was especially sad that he couldn't play the same great grandpa role for his own grandsons that he had played for my son, but that would not have changed, no matter how or exactly when he died. Jack himself had been with loved ones when they died bad deaths. He told people that they had died peacefully in their sleep. Isn't that what everyone wants, to die peacefully in their sleep? That is what Jack wanted, what he planned for, and thankfully what he achieved. And would I want this choice? I would, but I would want it to be legal. Oregon has had this law since 1994 and 1997. So this is kind of the current state of legislation. Washington has had it since 2008. Those were both by ballot measure. Vermont passed it by legislative action, and then in 2015, California did pass its End-of-Life Option Act, and it has been implemented since June 9th. Since then, I think 20 additional states now, because Michigan was added to this, have introduced legislation. Now, we all know that just because you introduce legislation doesn't mean that it's going to pass, but people are having the conversation. An important step in passing California's law was that the California Medical Association took a neutral stance. So instead of opposing it, they took a neutral stance. And then they even went so far as to recommend that the American Medical Association revisit their stance on it, and they are actually doing that this fall. I'm not sure where they'll go with that, but it's interesting that they're at least revisiting the issue. And amazingly enough, I usually say, and nothing's going on in Ohio, but as of this weekend, in a Columbus Dispatch article, Ohio Senator Charletta Tavares just said that she plans to introduce a version of the Death with Dignity Act in 2017. So I hope to meet with her soon. I hope to find out what she's hoping for or who she's working with. And she says it's time to have the discussion in our state, and we shouldn't be afraid of it, and I think that's great. She is Assistant Minority Leader and Ranking Minority Member of the Health and Human Services Committee. Moving forward, there's a lot of work to do. I've started talking about this in Ohio just because I feel like so many people have never heard of it. We don't talk about death and dying very much. One of the first steps I find is asking people to just say out loud, I would like a death with dignity law in Ohio, because that's hard to say for a lot of people. We have a lot of work to do. My mission is to provide education like this. I think people need to know about it. We need to talk about it in different levels of community. The medical community, who would potentially be the ones actually, implementing this, need to understand it. Political community needs to understand it. Everyone as a whole needs to understand it. But we'll be hopefully working toward lobby days and just getting people to talk about it and share their stories. A lot of times in other states, it's been really helpful having people share their stories about this. So in conclusion, my mother and I have great respect for hospice and palliative care. But for Jack, it was incredibly important to be in complete control of his death, since he lived in a state with that legal option. He was one of the very few people who requested the aid in dying medication and then used it. The peaceful death that he achieved, we really consider to be a gift. So thank you. I hope you'll join me in working toward this type of law in Ohio.
Yes, I understand that my whole life is just a blink of an eye. The history of the earth is with each moment that goes by. But this moment that I'm with you, it feels like time has stood still. It feels somehow like it matters, and that it always will. Thank you so much.